Chapter 6, Rorschach's chapter. Obviously a pretty dark, bleak chapter philosophically, but definitely some interesting ideas going on here, and I think the thrust of this chapter really hinges on the question of how we interpret this symbol before us in this very opening image. Though there's maybe not as much to analyze in terms of depth of just this particular image in and of itself, like we've seen with other chapters. I think this image and how we come to understand what these ink blots ultimately mean have huge significance in terms of the ultimate figurative meaning of this chapter and the deeper symbolism of what Rorschach's mask means. And I think the fault line here lies between two different interpretations. We'll see there's almost a debate going on throughout this chapter between the psychoanalyst and Rorschach himself. And the psychoanalyst tries to use the Rorschach inkblot tests as a way to prove that ultimately Rorschach is just conditioned to see the world through a negative lens. That his inability to cope with negative emotions has ultimately led him to view the world through a distorted lens. And Rorschach, meanwhile, will push in the opposite direction by conveying that his view of the world is not distorted, but is in fact an accurate depiction of reality. And so what then do the Rorschach ink blots mean is something that we will have to explore within this chapter. But that's the big question. Is Rorschach's view shaped primarily by negative events, especially those of his early childhood? Is he merely conditioned psychologically to see the bad in the world? Or does Rorschach have philosophical validity to what he is saying? That is the question that we're exploring here. So let's just hop on in. So we can see the stakes of this debate, or at least the setup of this debate, is seen right here in these opening pages, where the psychoanalyst is trying to give Rorschach the inkblot tests. And so this raises the question, right? What is the Rorschach inkblot test? And this was something that's used by psychoanalysts who are different actually than therapists. Psychoanalysts are probably under the branch of therapy, but it's a very particular form that was inspired by Freudian psychology. So just to give a brief review, or perhaps it's your first time looking at Freud, here's Freud's iceberg theory of the self. And very briefly, you could pause this video and look at these subpoints in greater depth if you want. The key idea of the Freudian theory of the self was that the self is not a unified, coherent, and singular entity, that we are not in fact conscious of most of the things that happen to us, and that in fact most of the reservoir of our feelings, thoughts, urges, memories, the things that really explain our behavior in a deep and profound way, are outside our conscious awareness. They're in what Freud would call the unconscious. And most contents here are kind of shaped by these unacceptable or unpleasant sensations. And Freud, moreover, was very interested in the way in which one's early childhood dramatically shaped their future personhood as they developed. And that especially if you got caught on particular hang-ups as a child, that could affect you in profound ways. And so the unconscious effect of these events can only become conscious through psychotherapy or psychoanalysis. Those terms are interchangeable. And so the goal of Freudian psychoanalysis was to try to bring these unconscious events into your conscious field of awareness. And he didn't believe that you could do that by just sitting there and meditating and thinking deeply about, wow, what were those early childhood experiences that shaped me in these profound and probably traumatic ways? What were those early events with my parents, for instance, that perhaps explain why I always get caught in these negative behavioral patterns? Instead, what Freud was really interested in was using techniques to get insights into the unconscious. And so dreams was a huge one. Freud was very into analyzing the symbolism of dreams, and that's one of the reasons why we treat dream symbolism so seriously in literature today. We have this implicit sense that if dreams are showing up in literature, they must have some sort of figurative significance in terms of understanding unconscious elements of that character. Slips of tongue were also important. Freud would also do free association, where he would say, for instance, tell me what word, give me the first word that comes to your mind when I say these words. And he would just give you words, right? He would be like butterfly, car, grass, so on and so forth, and you would just respond honestly with what was going on there, and Freud would see if there were any patterns. And then finally, Rorschach inkblot tests. And you can see one here at the bottom. You've been seeing them throughout. So the way the Rorschach inkblot test would work, obviously it's just kind of random blots on a page in a symmetrical pattern. But the psychoanalyst would ask you, what do you see here? What image do you see? And whatever your mind goes to first, the psychoanalyst would deem to have some symbolic significance, right? So if you said that you were seeing terrifying waves in this Rorschach inkblot test below, perhaps the psychoanalyst would dig a little bit deeper into that to realize that you have some fear of some impending catastrophe within your life, just as an example. And by the way, right, psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, not very scientifically well supported, right? Those are not the forms of therapy that you would get if you were to go into a therapist today. I think you could actually probably find a psychoanalyst if you looked hard enough. They are incredibly expensive and require extensive meetings, and there's not a lot of scientific evidence. But what's impressive about Freud, who was writing in the late 1800s and early 1900s, is he is really bringing the ideas that we have about the self to the forefront in a way that nobody had done before. Like, Freud is essential for our understanding of psychology as being about the unconscious ways in which our mind tricks us into certain behaviors. And yes, while Freud's specific theories have been disproven, I think it's very impressive the way in which Freud's influence continues to be huge in the realm of psychology, right? I think that entire discipline wouldn't have been possible without Freud, even if his specific conclusions and his specific techniques have been disproven. That basic theory that our brain, that we are not fully conscious, that we are not fully rational, that we are not fully in control of our actions, that in fact our brain is governed by unconscious processes, I think that's still a core tenet of psychology. They just have more refined techniques now. Regardless, that was a long-winded way of saying that's what this therapist is going to be doing. And so we'll see that early childhood events here end up being very important to this psychologist or psychoanalyst theory of Rorschach. And just by the way, right, these are some examples that we've seen in terms of the ways in which early childhood events could shape you. So if you were abused a lot as a child, you might end up having a shattered self-esteem growing up. If you have over-controlling parents, you might have a lessened sense of self-reliance, so on and so forth. And you could look at these other examples. If you have a traumatic experience, you could develop a phobia or anxiety, so on and so forth. And I think implicitly, right, we understand that there's some truth to this. Maybe reducing the entirety of a person's behavior to early childhood experiences is a bit of an oversimplification, but nevertheless, hopefully you all understand a little bit of what's going on here, or at least what the psychoanalyst is trying to prove about Rorschach. And so this psychoanalyst believes that he'll be able to fix him. He says right up here in the middle, I'm optimistic a success here could make my reputation. He's asking Rorschach to tell him what he sees in these Rorschach inkblot tests, and obviously Rorschach sees this horrific image of a dog's head split open. Of course, at this point, we don't know what it is, but, now that you've read the whole chapter, you should know. But Rorschach, of course, lies and says a pretty butterfly. And the whole idea of an inkblot test is if you have, positive responses, it probably means that you're healthy. But if you are, ruminating on really negative, grotesque imagery, there's probably something to dig up there. And so this therapist at the beginning foolishly thinks that Rorschach is getting better. He says, I just wish he wasn't so intense. And then he says, I just wish he wouldn't stare at me like that. And so the title, The Abyss Gazes, also, I think will give us the other way to view this chapter, right? The first way is about Rorschach's view being psychologically conditioned. Is Rorschach purely a psychologically damaged character? Is that all we're meant to interpret him as? Or is he more figuratively significant of a deeper philosophical idea that pertains to this symbol of the abyss? That's something that we will explore. So, let's go through. He gives us some details about Rorschach's real identity, Walter Joseph Kovacs, or maybe it'd be Kovac since it's Polish. Regardless, I'll say Kovacs. We keep going. He says the cops don't like him. The underworld doesn't like him. Nobody likes him. I've never met anyone quite so alienated. How on earth did he get like this? So Rorschach, right, classic sense of alienation here that's going to be quite significant to his character. So isolation, alienation, big parts of Rorschach's identity, obviously. He doesn't seem to be capable of connections with others. And again, we'll have to explore why. So psychoanalyst asks him to tell him what he sees here. And obviously you can kind of see these two little squigglies. And of course, Rorschach in his mind kind of fills this in with this image of his mother with another man. And so what is this? What's going on in the scene? We find out that his mother is a prostitute and that she was sleeping with a stranger. Walter, or I guess Rorschach, believed that this man was hurting her, and so he came in to take a look. And you can see here the cruel things that is said, right? The man says, "I said, forget it. Here's $5. It's more than you're worth." And then she says, $5, you bastard, you lousy bastard. Don't you dare walk out on me. Don't you dare. And then she ends up smacking Rorschach, saying, "Mom," and he says, Mom, I'm sorry. I thought he was hurting you. She says, "You little shit. You know what you just cost me, you ugly little bastard. I should have listened to everybody else. I should have had the abortion," as Rorschach is crying. So we should ask ourselves now, in what way has this event shaped aspects of Rorschach's identity that we see in the present day? Well, obviously, one thing that we see right off the bat from the very first page of the entire graphic novel is Rorschach very much dislikes sexuality. He seems to have an aversion to it. He seems to have not just a hang-up about it, but he views it as one of the moral and corrupting sins that he always sees in others. He always calls others prostitutes, and he views that as the ultimate insult. And moreover, he views people indulging in sex as a form of hedonism, a form of sin, a form of filth that he seeks to correct, right? And so if you were to put on your Freudian hat, you would argue that clearly this early childhood experience of this association of sexuality with this abuse has led Rorschach to have a stunted and perhaps unhealthy and repressed sense of sexuality. And that is why he has such an aversion to it. In fact, what he is probably doing here is projecting his own negative emotions from these early childhood experiences onto others. So, okay, this kind of gives us one point in the therapist camp, right? It shows us that, okay, perhaps Rorschach is just psychologically conditioned to view the world in a certain way. And so, of course, Rorschach lies about what he sees. He just says some nice flowers. And so the therapist thinks he's doing great work. He says, "Peace out." As Rorschach's going in, all the criminals are shouting at him, obviously, because he put all of them in prison. And as he's going into his cell, and I think these images, especially in the middle, just do a great job of showing the sort of emotional deadness that Rorschach embodies. He doesn't seem to have a vibrant or emotional sense of self. He seems to be totally deadened unless he has his mask on, unless he's embodying that Rorschach identity. But we get a second flashback here as all these people are shouting at him, and we see that these are two bullies making fun of him, and especially giving him some crap about his mom. So Rorschach says, "I have to get something from the store for my mother." And then they say, "Haha, I got something I could give you, mama." So I guess, guys, they're still making your mama jokes in the 1980s. Says, "Sure, why not? Everybody else does, way I hear it. Is that right, kid? Is your mama a whore?" "Sure she is. He's gonna fix us up with her. Ain't that right, whore son?" And he's like, "Let me get by. I have to go." And then they crush the apple in the face, call him a whore son. Feels bad, right? And obviously, as they're calling him out, saying that he has cooties, he has diseases, he needs an examination, he doesn't have a dad, so on and so forth, he ends up grabbing a cigarette and placing the burning end in the dude's eye. Pretty brutal. And then he starts biting off part of his face. And you can see here, right? They're saying quite hurtful things. They're saying, "God, look, that filthy animal, look. For God's sake, somebody pull him off before." And then they say, "Hold his arms, hold his arms. Ought to be locked up. See him biting that. Blame the parents like an animal, like a mad dog. Exactly like a mad dog." And we kind of see that crazed, animalistic look in Rorschach's mind. And obviously in the last chapter, chapter 5, we were doing a case study, I think, in the ways in which Rorschach has become animalistic, savage, violent, barbaric in his pursuit of trying to stop evil. So once again, we see another example of the way in which early childhood experiences of being bullied have perhaps conditioned Rorschach to see others as evil and have taught him that the only reaction to this is to be violent and savage, that is the way to end this kind of suffering. And so, the psychoanalyst view here would be that Rorschach is unhealthily coping with these negative emotions and continues to project them out onto the world, out onto others, and he is not healthily managing with this. So, therapist gives us some more info. In 1951, he attacked an older child, partially blinding him with a lighted cigarette. He was 10 years old. Once his home life had been investigated, he was removed from his mother's custody and put into care. Away from her, he seemed to improve. Excelling at schoolwork, Kovacs grew into a bright but unusually quiet child. Even in 1956, when informed of his mother's brutal murder, he restricted his comments to one word: good. So, okay, rough, right? And we learn throughout this chapter what was Rorschach's home situation. No father, never met his father, wasn't a part of his life. His mother was a prostitute and abusive towards him, both emotionally and physically. And then he was bullied a lot as a kid. So all of that you could probably understand, okay, we're starting to see perhaps what's going on with Rorschach here and why he is the way he is. And if we actually take a look here, if we scroll down to the end, we get some good insight into this from the end documents that I think continue to support this thesis about I think it gives more points to the psychotherapist about why Rorschach is the way he is. So that first sheet just gives us some information about Rorschach. This next one, again, kind of goes into his early life, just clarifies who his mother was, clarify that his father wasn't there. And it says right here exactly when she drifted into prostitution as a means of meeting her mounting debts is uncertain, but it seems likely that her last semi-permanent relationship was with the true father of Walter Kovacs, who left her 2 months before the baby was born. Mrs. Kovacs was either unable or unwilling to provide any details concerning him other than that his name was Charlie. Since shortly after the birth of her son, we see Mrs. Kovacs' first arrest on charges of prostitution, we can perhaps assume that the additional cost of keeping an infant child may have been what necessitated this new occupation, and perhaps also speculate as to whether the above factors were the cause of the resentment and cruelty which Sylvia Kovacs showed to her son as he grew older. Okay, so we're seeing here pretty straightforward. We find out that he was pretty good at school, so on and so forth. I think the more interesting documents come over here. So this is a letter that Walter wrote about his parents when he was a small child. And let's see, again, put on your Freudian hat here, try to get insight into how do these early negative events, how does his home situation help to explain the way that Rorschach is, and what evidence do we see here? So it says, I have 2 parents, although actually I don't have any. I never see my mom, but that's okay, although I'd like to see my dad sometimes. You should be asking yourself, why does he want to see his dad? He doesn't even know who his dad is. He's never met him. I've never met my dad, and I would sure like to. He had to leave our house when I wasn't even born, I guess because he couldn't get along with my mother. I would have done the same if I was him. I used to ask my mom about my dad, but she doesn't talk about him. His name was Charlie, which is short for Charles, although it has the same number of letters. She says she doesn't know his second name, although how can you live with somebody if you don't know who they are? It's just stupid. My mom told me she threw my dad out because he was always getting into political arguments with her because he liked President Truman, and she didn't. I think perhaps my dad was some sort of aide to President Truman because he liked him so much. Most probably he was out of the country during the war when I was growing up on some sort of mission. I think he was the kind of guy who would fight for his country and what was right. Maybe he got killed fighting the Nazis, and he's with God now, and that's how come he never managed to find me. I like President Truman, the way Dad would have wanted me to. He dropped the atom bomb on Japan and saved millions of lives because if he had enough, then there would have been a lot more war than there was, and more people would have been killed. So, okay, important things here, right? Notice that in the very opening page of Watchmen, Rorschach says all these filthy, sinful people could have followed in the steps of good men, decent men who believed in a day's work, men like President Truman. So notice that he has come to identify very heavily with President Truman, who was obviously just around when he would have been being born or a little kid. And notice he has this fantasy about his dad being this patriotic hero. None of this having any evidence to support it, and probably his dad was probably a scumbag, right? Who ended up leaving the mother because he didn't want to be with her, didn't want the responsibility of raising Rorschach. So how would a psychoanalyst or a Freudian thinker explain this? Well, clearly the negligence or the lack of love within Rorschach's life has led him to need to create this fantasy in order to fill that void. And that fantasy is through a father figure, someone who could represent some form of authority, some form of guidance, some form of order and structure in his life that he doesn't have through his mother. So again, we can see here, and I think there's a compelling argument that Rorschach's patriotic values are coming from these early childhood experiences. We see this again in this weird dream on this next page. Again, think about the importance of dreams for a psychoanalyst. It says, a man was in my old house with my mom. They were eating stuff like raw dough, and my mom choked on a piece. The guy with her tried to fish it out of her throat. He got his whole hand in her mouth, and then it was like he had his whole arm down her throat. So notice this intermingling, right, of kind of sexual imagery of inserting orifices, and also kind of corresponding with something violent, something unnatural, something wrong, which clearly those things get melded in Rorschach's mind. He does not view sexuality as something natural and good, but he views it as something quite unnatural and sinful and, in fact, evil. He told me to get a doctor, so I ran out of the room, but the house was all different and there wasn't any doctor there anyway, so I went back to find my mom. I was walking down this sort of hallway, and it was dark, and I saw what looked like my mom and this guy dancing, old-fashioned dancing at the other end of the room, and they didn't have any clothes on. So, okay, more sexual imagery. They were sort of clopping around like a horse in a pantomime with two guys in a suit. When they got nearer, I saw they weren't dancing at all. They were squashed together like Siamese twins, joined at the face and chest and stomach. Again, notice that what he's clearly talking about is imagery of sex. But notice in his little kid imagination, it has gotten morphed together into this nightmarish image that seems very unnatural and grotesque. They didn't have any face. You could only see their two ears, or their ears, two on either side of their head facing each other. Their hands were growing into each other as well, but they had all four legs free, and they were sort of dancing sideways towards me down the dark hall like a crab, and there was something tripping them up, wrapped around their feet, and I looked down, and I saw it was trousers and underwear and stuff. They were coming towards me, and then I woke up. I had feelings when I woke up, dirty feelings, thoughts and stuff. So notice, this is actually kind of aroused Rorschach in a weird way. And note that it is Freud who came up with the concept of the edible complex. This is one of his infamous theories that people usually point to as a way to discredit and show how laughable Freudian ideas are. But he believed that as a small child, we developed symbolic sexual feelings towards our mother as the first, female that we meet. We don't need to get into that or take it very literally. It's more symbolic. But nevertheless, we can see here it has some validity with Rorschach. And he clearly has a revulsion to it. He says, the dream, it sort of upset me physically. I couldn't help it. I just feel bad talking about it. So again, we're getting lots of evidence here for the ways in which Rorschach's early childhood experiences are really helping to explain the values that he has when he grows up. His patriotism, his political alliances, his aversion to sexuality, his desire to punish evil, all of these things are coming to the fore even when he was a small child, and perhaps help to explain it. So okay, that's the therapist's view, but now I gotta view the other side. All right. So, and by the way, notice that at this point, therapist, wife, they're having a good time. Things seem good and happy in terms of their family. Next day. Sorry, late night. Today I would like to do something different. Frankly, Walter, I'd like to talk. I'd like to talk about Rorschach. Will you do that for me, Walter? Will you tell me about Rorschach? You can see his response. You keep calling me Walter. I don't like you. You don't like me? All right. Why is that exactly? Fat, wealthy. You think you understand pain. I'll tell you something, doctor. I'll tell you about Rorschach. All right. So now we're going to start to see Rorschach's arguments. Let's see what his claims are. 1956, age 16, left children's home, became unskilled manual worker, garment industry. Job bearable, but unpleasant, had to handle female clothing. 1962, special order for dress in new Dr. Manhattan spin-off fabric, viscous fluids between two layers, latex, heat and pressure sensitive. Customer young girl, Italian name, never collected order, said dress looked ugly. Wrong, not ugly at all. Black and white, moving, changing shape, but not mixing, no gray. Very, very beautiful. So with your figurative analysis brains going, you should see very clearly, right, black and white. Why does Rorschach like the black and white, moving, never mixing? Well, clearly he doesn't like gray. If you think about situations and how we use those terms, black and white, it's meant to represent absolutes. and gray is about a middle ground or complexity or nuance. And that's not what Rorschach likes. Clearly, Rorschach likes clear absolute values, and he associates that with beauty. He doesn't want to think about his mother's situation as being more complicated, right? Her being a single mother without a father, without a steady income, having to perhaps turn to extreme means to help to support her child, and that the frustration that must have brought perhaps led to some outlet of anger on Rorschach. No. Just, it's easier to say she is evil, the world is evil, and I will punish that evil. There's good, there's evil, there's right, there's wrong, and evil must be punished. That's easier to probably believe in, and especially psychologically, it gives Rorschach clarity in a world that very much seems ambiguous, something that we've been exploring. So he takes that home, and then he says 2 years passed, March 1964, stopped at newsstand on way to work, brought paper, there she was, front page. Woman who'd ordered special dress, Kitty Genovese. So this is interesting because Kitty Genovese is actually a real person, and the story he's about to explain is something that actually happened and is used in psychology textbooks as the example of the principle called the bystander effect, which is the idea that, like, let's say you walk past somebody and you see somebody beating up somebody else on the street. They've actually done studies on this and realized that very few people will do anything. Or if you see an accident on the side of a freeway, very few people will actually end up calling 911 because everybody else, the principle is that everybody else thinks, somebody else will do it. And so here's what happened with Kitty Genovese. I'm sure that was the woman's name. Raped, tortured, killed here in New York, outside her own apartment building. Almost 40 neighbors heard screams. Nobody did anything. Nobody called cops. Some of them even watched. Do you understand? Some of them even watched. So just to make sure we understand what's going on with the Kitty Genovese case, right? She was raped outside of a New York apartment building and murdered. And supposedly, and there's lots of articles to say whether the historiography on this is correct or not, but supposedly, as the story goes, tons of people watched and did nothing. The bystander effect was at play. And so what is Rorschach's conclusion here? He says, I knew what people were then behind all the evasions, all the self-deception. Ashamed for humanity, I went home. I took the remains of her unwanted dress, and I made a face that I could bear to look at in the mirror. So, okay, you should be asking yourself, we have heard this kind of language before about people hiding behind evasions, people hiding behind self-deceptions or masks, and who has been doing that? The comedian, right? The comedian had actually a very similar view as Rorschach that understands that beneath humanity's lies and pretenses to moral goodness, that in fact we are probably savage, depraved, violent, selfish, that we won't act on moral principles if they put our own lives in danger. If they conflict with our own self-interest, we won't end up doing anything about it. Let's keep going. Therapist says, Walter, is what happened to Kitty Genovese really proof that the whole of mankind is rotten? I think you've been conditioned with a negative worldview. So, okay, if you guys have been missing what the therapist's argument is, he gives it to you. That's his thesis right there. There are good people too, like, and Rorschach says, like you. Me? Oh, well, I wouldn't say that. No, you just think it. Think you're good people. Why are you spending so much time with me, doctor? Well, because I care about you and because I want to make you well. Other people down in cells behavior more extreme than mine. You don't spend any time with them. But then they're not famous. Won't get your name in journals. You don't want to make me well. Just want to know what makes me sick. So right here, Rorschach is calling out the therapist's selfish intentions. He's saying, look, you think of yourself in your metaphorical mask, in your nice little suit with your nice little family, so on and so forth. You've deluded yourself into thinking you're a good person. But look at what you're doing. You hopped on this case as a way of advancing your own career, of trying to make a name for yourself. And so he's calling out the selfish intentions that lie beneath the masks and pretenses and self-delusions that humanity puts on. And then he leaves with this ominous, you'll find out. Have patience, doctor, you'll find out. And so notice right here, the therapist will try to continue to assert his view of things, but we can see there's starting to be a little bit of a crack in it. He says, of course, what we have here is a classic case of misdirected aggression. Again, a kind of Freudian psychological concept. Kovacs hated his mother. After her death, he needed somewhere to put the anger, and so he chose the criminal fraternity. Another way to think about this concept is just the concept of projection, right? You end up having a negative emotion, maybe towards your parents, but you know it'd be unacceptable to take it out on them. Actually, this ends up usually happening the other way around. Let's say you're frustrated at your friends. You're not just going to freak out and shout at them, but then you come home and your mom says something and all of a sudden you find yourself blowing up and freaking out and shouting at her. Like, she didn't deserve that, but I'm sure you all can relate to that, or you've done that at some point. That's projection. The flimsy story about Kitty Genovese is obviously there to justify his behavior to himself. It's perfectly simple. Case solved. You'll find out. I wonder what he meant by that. Later. The deputy warden just called. Apparently Kovacs was involved in an incident today, just after he had seen me. It happened during lunch in the canteen. So this guy, right, basically tells him he's going to shank him with a prison shiv. And then what does Rorschach do? He ends up tossing the burning oil into the dude's face. Do not mess with Rorschach. The guards intervene, dragging Kovacs away to solitary and the other man to the prison hospital. According to the deputy warden, his burns were horrific. Hot, cooking fat. I don't like to think about it. As they dragged him away, Rorschach spoke to the other inmates. He said, "None of you understand. I'm not locked up in here with you. You're locked up in here with me." Pretty powerful, right? My argument is going to be that this statement that Rorschach says is not only true on a literal sense of the prisoners being locked up in there with Rorschach, but also in a more figurative sense, this psychoanalyst is being locked up in a figurative prison that is Rorschach's philosophical views. And we'll see the way in which this prison continues to develop throughout this chapter. And he's realizing that he's starting to refer to Kovacs as Rorschach. Right? Kovacs, not Rorschach. And then as his wife comes in, he's starting to have his work life interfere with his personal life. She kind of calls him out. And I think this image right here is the telling one, where you can see the darkness intruding around Mal's face. And this face is more than just that of frustration. Like, I think on the left, you can see frustration in the face. But here, you can see something a little bit deeper. Perhaps a deeper form of angst in a more existential sense, as we're about to talk about it very soon here. Perhaps more of a sense of dread or desolation. So, anyways, it says, "You're locked up in here with me." He's right. He's absolutely right. And so we can see this metaphorical prison start to form around him as he gets deeper into the metaphorical Rorschach prison cell. Let's continue. Next Rorschach bit. All right. After the murder of Kitty Genovese, you decided to vent your hostility upon the underworld. Making a mask for yourself, you decided to become Rorschach, and don't be stupid. I wasn't Rorschach then. Then I was just Kovacs. Kovacs pretending to be Rorschach. Being Rorschach takes a certain kind of insight. So, quick pause. You should be asking yourself, wait, what's the insight? What's the understanding? What's the knowledge that Rorschach doesn't have yet that makes it so that he's not truly Rorschach? We'll see. Back then, just thought I was Rorschach. Very naive, very young, very soft. Soft? How do you mean? Soft on scum. Too young to know any better. Mollycoddled them. Let them live. As opposed to Mr. Jacoby and the other murders you're charged with, presumably. Well, looking at your file, there's no record of serious violence against criminals before 1975. Like I say, soft. Hadn't realized the stakes we were playing for back then. All of us, me, my friends, all soft. So you can see here, right? Rorschach wasn't fully Rorschach back then. I mean, if you remember from this scene with the crime busters, his word bubbles weren't all jagged like they are when he dons his Rorschach mask in the present. Kovacs had friends, other men in costumes. All Kovacs was, man in a costume. So again, on a figurative level, costume being a good symbol of deceptions or lies or delusions or trying to hide something. Not Rorschach at all. In 1965, worked with Night Owl, bringing street gangs under control, tackled the big figure together, brought down underboss together. Good team. Until he got soft, like the rest, until he quit. No staying power, none of them, except comedian. So notice, we should probably appreciate at this point why he likes the comedian. Both of them, I think, have very similar views of humanity. Now, the conclusions that we'll come to are quite different, but let's take a look. It says, forceful personality, didn't care. If people liked him, uncompromising. Admired that. Of all of us, he understood most. About world, about people, about society, and what's happening to it. Things everyone knows in gut. Things everyone's too scared to face, too polite to talk about. He understood. Understood man's capacity for horrors and never quit. Saw the world's black underbelly and never surrendered. Once a man is seen, he can never turn his back on it, never pretend it doesn't exist, no matter who orders him to look the other way. So fascinating, right? They have the same starting premises about humanity, that ultimately humans hide behind masks and delusions to try to hide their underlying capacity for horror. But that if you dispel that, what do you see? You see the world's black underbelly. And notice here, we do not do this thing because it is permitted. We do it because we have to. We do it because we are compelled. And some obvious visual analysis. The newspaper here in the lower bit of this panel has the Keene Act headline, which is obviously about trying to make vigilantes illegal. And then you can see who watches the Watchmen up there, and Rorschach has beaten this man up, right? He does not do this because he is ordered to. He does not do this because higher authorities command him to. He does not do this because it is legitimized by society. He does this because he views it as the only rational response to a world of moral ambiguity, to a world where what humans are is fundamentally corrupt and evil and filled with the capacity for horror. Let's keep going. So while Rorschach and the comedian have the same starting premises, we will see in this next flashback that they have dramatically different reactions, right? The comedian chooses to become a parody of humanity's depravity, exposing the joke that is the fantasy of moral clarity, whereas Rorschach will have a very different view. And this will help us to understand how he got to his absolute moral values. So the therapist is understanding this, right? He's like, all of these things. He never says what it is that compels him. It's not his childhood, his mother, or Kitty Genovese. These things just made him overreact to the injustice in the world. They're not what sent him over its edge. So by the way, notice this is a big concession on the part of the therapist. He's admitting that the early childhood experiences do not fully explain the extent to which Rorschach has reacted to the world, right? They're not what sent him over the edge. They don't help to explain fully what's wrong with Rorschach. So he's admitting that Rorschach's childhood cannot be the sole determiner of what made him like this. It's as if continual contact with society's grim elements have shaped him into something grimmer, something even worse. If only I could convince him that life isn't like that, the world isn't like that. I'm positive it isn't. So notice the therapist is still trying to hold to a worldview that think, no, there is good in the world. Bought a Gazette on way home, including a small piece about Kovacs, which a newspaper vendor pointed out. So, okay, Rorschach had been coming there. Middle panel, it says, so is the front page. Russian tanks have entered Pakistan. On 7th Ave, someone had sprayed silhouette figures onto the wall. It reminded me of the people disintegrated at Hiroshima, leaving only their indelible shadows. So obviously a reference to the nuclear bombs dropped on Japan. At home, Gloria seemed anxious to sweeten things after yesterday and told me she'd invited Randy and Diana to dinner tomorrow. Was too exhausted to take in all the details and suggested an early night. And again, hopefully you're noticing here that even though he says, I'm positive there's goodness within the world, everything he has subsequently noted, or at least from the visuals, we can see that there seems to be quite negative stuff going on around him, right? He seems to be increasingly focused on the violent or depraved aspects of the world, or the isolation or alienation that he is experiencing from his wife. And so now we get to the important scene here. And it says, today he told me everything. And so Rorschach finally tells him what he's actually seeing, a dog with head split in half. He says, I see, and who do you think split the dog's head in half? And Rorschach says, I did. And so, okay, now we're getting to the interesting stuff here. 1975, kidnap case. Perhaps you remember. Blair Roche, 6 years old. Kidnappers believe she was connected to Roche Chemical Fortune. Stupid mistake. Father was bus driver. No money at all. Days dragged by. No word from kidnappers. Thought of little child, abused, frightened. Didn't like it. Personal reasons. So notice, what are his personal reasons? Well, he was a little child who was abused and frightened quite often. Anyways, decided to intervene. Promised parents I would return her unharmed. Visit underworld bars and began hurting people. Put 14 in hospital needlessly. 15th gave me an address. Disused dressmaker in Brooklyn. Bad neighborhood, smelled of damp plaster and stained mattresses. Arrived there at dusk. No lights on in building. Something was making noise in wasteland at rear. Attack dogs. 2 German shepherds fighting over knob of bone. Didn't seem interested in me. Decided not to use rear entrance anyway. Went in through front door like respectable visitor. Obviously a joke as he's breaking into this door. And he comes on in, and I find these next 2 pages quite striking, quite powerful. And I think the power comes from actually the lack of dialogue. The atrocity that he is witnessing here isn't necessarily explicitly spelled out, right? He finds some of the clothes of the little girl. He finds the cleaver. He finds the mark. He sees the dogs chewing the bone. Obviously, the imagery being shrouded in red, which we could figuratively associate with violence. But I think the fact that it is unstated is actually quite powerful, and anybody who is aspiring to be a creative writer should take note of the restraint that Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons have here. In some ways, I think it's actually more horrific to not fully articulate what has happened, but to show us a glimpse and to give us a hint of this unspeakable atrocity than to just spell it out. And so anyways, now we get to the important Rorschach monologue as he pulls up the cleaver to bring it down on the dogs. It says, shock of impact ran along my arm. Jet of warmth splattered on chest like hot faucet. It was Kovacs who said mother, then muffled under latex. So probably he was saying mother and then the F word, right? But notice also the figurative significance of just the word mother being articulated, a link to those very first childhood experiences. It was Kovacs who closed his eyes. It was Rorschach who opened them again. So, okay, I symbolism here. This is about knowledge. It's about understanding. What has he learned? What has he become awakened to in terms of his view and his perspective of the world? According to my informant, man using premises named Gerald Grice. Out drinking when I called. Returned to dressmakers at 10:45. Dark by then. Dark as it gets. So notice, by the way, that this symbol, the Rorschach ink blot, is coming up again and again right here in this scene. But I don't think we can reduce this scene to Rorschach's early childhood experiences, right? This atrocity speaks to something else. And this is going to give us our other interpretation of what this symbol really truly means. So as this guy comes home, he gets the cut up dog to the face. Rorschach attaches him to the water heater here, and basically lights it on fire, gives him a saw. So if any of you have seen the Saw movies, you can see Rorschach thought of it first, before Jigsaw was even a thing. And now we get the big part of the monologue. Stood in street, watched it burn. Imagined limbless felt torsos inside, breasts blackening, bellies smoldering, bursting into flame one by one. Watched for an hour. Nobody got out. And this is the big one, right? Stood in firelight, sweltering bloodstain on chest like map of violent new continent. Felt cleansed, felt dark planet turn under my feet, and knew what cats know that makes them scream like babies in night. So notice this language of discovery. Right? The blood stain on his chest is like a map of a violent new continent. This is associated with discovery and exploration. And so what has he explored? What has he discovered here? Well, notice it's also linked to a figurative sense of cleansing, of moral purity here. Not because he has cleansed himself of sins that he has committed, but he seems to have cleansed through these flames. He has led to a sense of cleansing through destruction of evil that he sees in the world. And flames obviously can be a form of purification and cleansing because they burn down what was there before. They destroy something that perhaps was corrupted. Looked at sky through smoke heavy with human fat, and God was not there. The cold, suffocating dark goes on forever, and we are alone. Whew, heavy lines. Hopefully everyone understands the meaning of these lines based on everything we've discussed. I mean, this connects exactly to Nietzsche's idea of the death of God, of the idea of inherent meaning no longer being there. The order, the structure seems to be negated by the evil and the depravity of mankind. The questions of theodicy that we've been exploring in this text so far come to a head here. And when he says we are alone, he's talking about that cosmic sense of isolation that I introduced in chapter 2. He says, live our lives lacking anything better to do, devise reason later. Born from oblivion, bear children, hell-bound as ourselves, go into oblivion. So notice that. What is our life, right? We are born out of nothing, and ultimately we return to nothing. Life is just a blip in between larger forms of oblivion. If that's your view of existence, well, that is pretty bleak in terms of our ability to generate meaning or moral truths. There's nothing else. Existence is random. has no pattern save what we imagine after staring at it for too long, no meaning save what we choose to impose. This rudderless world is not shaped by vague metaphysical forces. It's not God who kills the children, not fate that butchers them or destiny that feeds them to the dogs. It's us, only us. Streets stank of fire. The void breathed hard on my heart, turning its illusions to ice, shattering them. Was reborn then, free to scrawl own design on this morally blank world. Was Rorschach. So, okay, heavy. I'm going to unpack this and help you to understand it. These are definitely deep existentialist ideas. But what Rorschach is saying here is these Rorschach ink blots are not symbols of the psychological or unconscious forces that shape our behaviors. No, they are evidence of the inherent lack of order or purpose or pattern or morality that exists within the world. The ink blots are a symbol for the godlessness, for the lack of any sort of plan or divine structure that governs our existence. And so with that, it becomes a quite different symbol than what the therapist has been looking at. And so let's understand this a little bit better, all right? And to understand the philosophy of existentialism as Rorschach is articulating it, we have to understand what existentialism is responding to. And that's the philosophy that's called essentialism, okay? So you should definitely have this in your notes. I think these are useful and important, and definitely an interesting philosophy to chew on. So essentialism is the belief that for most of human history existed, and it was the idea that everything, including humans, has an essence. So what is an essence? It's a core set or a set of core properties that are necessary or essential for a thing to be what it is. It is the inherent properties. So ask yourself, right, what is the essence of a water bottle? Well, the essence of a water bottle is it must be a container that can hold water. It doesn't matter if the water bottle is blue or purple or green or clear and transparent. Those are not constitutive elements of its essence. But if it cannot contain water, then it is not a water bottle, right? And the idea of an essence is that it applies to humans as well. And so the idea of essentialism is that our essence actually precedes or comes before our existence. In the same way, right, imagine if you're a human at the old watering hole at a body of water back in the prehistoric days, and you're starting to contemplate, well, I want a way to transport this water, you conceive of the essence, of the inherent property of a water bottle. You say, I want a container that can hold and transport water so I don't have to come to this gosh darn lake every time I want water. And then you will that into existence. You create an object that can meet that inherent property that you were contemplating in your mind. And the idea was that actually humans had an essence too. Well, what gives humans our essence? Most of the time it was based on religious ideas, right? The Christian essence was the soul. God created the universe. God willed humans into existence. He made us in his image. He gave us a soul. And he has a purpose for us, right? And that purpose is defined by us kind of living up to his commandments, us, turning away from a life of sin, so on and so forth, and being redeemed at the end. And the nice thing about this world is that we have inherent meaning, right? We're not born into a random, meaningless, orderless, structureless universe. No, we are born into a universe where we had a clear essence before we were even born. And that's the big idea of essentialism, is before you are even born, you have an essential inherent element to yourself that can help to define your sense of meaning. In the same way that a water bottle's essence of being a container that holds water gives clarity as to what its importance is. And so, in this worldview of essentialism, which pretty much every human culture has until the modern world, humanity believed that there was meaning already there for us, right? That there is inherent meaning that can define our purpose. Now let's go to the world of existentialism, which has its roots in 19th century thinkers, where people are beginning to challenge the core beliefs of essentialism. And scientific inquiry, specifically empiricism, the idea that truth needs to come from an empirical observation of the world, that you can't just accept something like a soul exists, you need to scientifically test it. You need to have empirical proof that it exists. You must be able to hold it up to the scientific method, otherwise you cannot prove it. Those ideas ended up contradicting essentialism, right? How can you prove what the inherent properties of our meaning or our sense of existence are through a scientific lens? You can't. There's no way to scientifically hypothesize what our purpose is and show empirically what that must be. And so by the end of the 19th century, by the time you get to Nietzsche, he's the real big father of existentialism. Thinkers begin to ask, what if there is no plan, right? And then we're born. What if we're born into a world and then we have to have a plan rather than there already being a plan for us? Because under the world of essentialism, right, if you're a true God-loving Christian, you believe God created the universe and God had a plan for you before you even came into existence. And so then the challenge of your existence is to, live out whatever essence God had planned for you. But if you don't believe in that worldview, then you're coming up against a much bleaker reality. And so this brings us to the existentialist motto, that existence actually precedes or comes before our essence. Just think about that, right? Essentialism believed the opposite, that our essence comes first and then our existence, right? God says humans will have a soul, humans have this divine purpose, they're to turn away from sin, they're to try to get into heaven, that is their purpose in their life. And then you're born, and you're like, whew, good thing God had this whole plan for me. The existentialist motto is the opposite. You are born, you start experiencing existence, and then you have to ask, well, shoot, what is my essence? What is my sense of purpose or meaning going to be? And so the conclusion is that there's no predetermined purpose, there's no set path to follow, there's no inherent meaning, and there's no order, right? You have to create those. And this corresponds perfectly in my mind to Nietzsche's argument about the death of God. He's not saying that we have literally killed God. He's not saying that we shouldn't believe in God. In fact, Nietzsche actually viewed it as a great tragedy that God was no longer a compelling being that could compel us to follow moral or value judgments of truth, right? And so Nietzsche, in fact, views this as a supreme tragedy that we no longer have any sort of purpose or inherent meaning or order. And Nietzsche's fear was that without God, we would descend into nihilism. And all of Nietzsche's work is an attempt to respond to nihilism, to try to create some sense of meaning, even if we don't have inherent meaning. And so absurdism, which we've discussed through the philosophy of Albert Camus, is kind of under this larger umbrella of existentialism. That's where the absurdism comes in, where once you've realized that we're born in a world without a plan, that we have to try to find meaning for ourselves in a universe that doesn't have any inherent meaning, that's where we confront the absurdity of our existence, that desire for clarity and meaning in the face of an indifferent universe without any plan for us. And often, we realize the absurdity of our existence through an encounter with death. And so for existentialists, death is a very important concept, right? Run-ins with death can often awaken us to the absurdity of our existence, the realization that we've been living our lives without any deeper sense of meaning. It kind of awakens us from the daily routines of our life and brings us more in touch with, holy shoot, what am I doing with my life? And that's oftentimes why we have that idea of a midlife crisis. It's at the point where people start to realize, oh my God, I'm over the hump here in terms of my life. I'm going to die at some point. What have I been doing with the last 40 years or 50 years? And that brings us to the thinker that would be most heavily associated with existentialism, right? Even though Nietzsche's philosophy is definitely an important starting point for existentialism, there were a couple other thinkers like Kierkegaard, for instance, who were very important. But Jean-Paul Sartre kind of took up this mantle and specifically articulated a philosophical set of beliefs that ended up being called existentialism. So that term existentialism didn't come into being until Jean-Paul Sartre, even if there were thinkers that were very influential to his thought. And he was writing in the 1930s and 1950s. I believe he was born in 1905 and lived all the way to 1980, but the heyday of Jean-Paul Sartre was right around World War II and right after World War II. And hopefully you can appreciate that those ideas of a world without order, without purpose, without structure, without meaning, make a lot more sense after World War II, where you see the senseless destruction, where you see the utter immorality and savagery and depravity of genocide and atomic bombs and civilian killing, so on and so forth. It makes sense why existentialism would start to become a more prominent philosophy. So this is what Sartre thought, and he is an existentialist. These are like the typical textbook definitions of existentialism. He says, if there are no inherent moral guidelines for our actions, right, if God is truly dead, then each of us is forced to design our own moral code to invent a morality to live by. All right, so let's make sure we understand that. He's saying, okay, we're born into a world. We don't have any clarity over our essence. We don't have any clarity over meaning. So it's up to us to design a moral code. The famous line from Sartre is, we are condemned to be free. That's probably his most famous quote. And why are we condemned? Well, he says, freedom is the only reality of our existences. That's why we're condemned to it. Like it or not, we don't get a choice, right? We are all like a prisoner, and the only thing that the only reality in our existence is freedom. So there's a paradox there, or an oxymoron, I should say, being condemned to freedom being something that seems to be about a release, but nevertheless, hopefully you understand the idea. We cannot turn to past sources of meaning, we cannot turn to authorities, and we cannot turn to others for answers, because that is negating our freedom. For Sartre, freedom is the only thing that exists in a world without any inherent meaning. And so living authentically means to accept the full weight of your freedom and its responsibility in the face of the absurd. The only meaning that your life has is given to it by you. So let's just repeat this point and make sure we understand it. Because this is the key idea for existentialists, is trying to find a form of living that is authentic. And authenticity is all about recognizing that meaning only emerges from myself, right? It can't come from somebody else. That vision of the world of moral clarity, of inherent meaning no longer exists. I have to create meaning for myself. And so I think this is actually the very hopeful element of existentialism. Even if it starts with incredibly bleak and depressing premises, it really tries to end on a hopeful note of trying to orient us towards finding meaning within our lives. And so what can this look like within your life? Well, it means not acting in what the existentialists call bad faith, which is a refusal to accept the responsibility of your freedom by letting others decide what your life means. And that's a form of inauthenticity. So let me give some more specific examples, right? Even if metaphysically you guys might not feel the crisis of this loss of inherent meaning within your own lives through the loss of God, this momentous event, perhaps you can relate in the way in which your parents perhaps have tried to give you an essence, right? Before you were even born, they probably had some vision of the way in which your life should be lived. You should be a doctor, you should be a lawyer, you should go to these schools, you should get this type of career. And to the existentialists, they would say it would be acting in bad faith if you merely accepted those without you determining in and of yourself that that is the life that you want to live. If you just want to be a doctor because that's what society has told you is good and that is what your parents have told you is good, that is living in bad faith. And so the challenge for an existentialist is to create a moral code that you yourself have created, that you yourself have chosen willingly and have given value. And that is a way to create meaning. So it's scary, and there's angst involved in this, another important existentialist concept, as you confront just how many choices freedom really has. It can be quite a burden, in fact, and that's something the existentialists tried to make clear, that there will be moments in which the vast array of choices that freedom puts before you is dizzying, right? It can be nauseating, in fact. But nevertheless, you have to courageously confront that meaningless universe and through your freedom find a mode of authentic living, because that is the only true and good way to find meaning for yourself. There's a famous story in which a man asked Jean-Paul Sartre, a young man during World War II, right? Sartre is French, and he was in France during World War II. Nazis had occupied France, and this man had asked Jean-Paul Sartre, he said, I want to join the French resistance to fight against the Nazis, but I'm not sure what I should do because I live with my sick mother. If I leave my sick mother, who lives by herself, she won't have anybody to care for her, and she will almost assuredly die. But if I stay with her, then I won't be able to be part of this greater cause and fight for my country, which I believe in dearly. What should I do? And Jean-Paul Sartre's response is, there is no correct answer. You have to decide for yourself what is authentically true. And whatever you end up deciding, as long as it is truly coming from yourself, that will be a correct answer. But if you just do what I say, that'd be acting in bad faith. So that's existentialism. Let's make sure we understand how this is playing out here. We can see these same ideas are playing out in Rorschach's philosophy, right? He says, notice the first premise of his philosophy is looked at the sky through smoke heavy with human fat, and God was not there. The cold, suffocating dark goes on forever, and we are alone. So that's the first premise, right? There's no inherent meaning. There's no God-giving structure. We are cosmically isolated from any sort of inherent meaning. We live our lives lacking anything better to do, devise reason later. So that's that idea, right? Existence precedes essence. Our existence comes first, and then we have to come up with some sort of meaning later. We come out of oblivion, and then we go back to oblivion. There's nothing else. He says existence is random, has no pattern save what we imagine after staring at it for too long. No meaning save what we choose to impose. So notice that idea of choice is very important. That comes to the existentialist idea of freedom. There is no inherent meaning. You'll never be able to prove that one thing means more than another. It's all about what we choose to give meaning in the world, right? So for some people, maybe that's reading books. For some people, maybe that's about being a good family member. For some people, maybe that's about raising herds of cats, so on and so forth, right? It doesn't matter what it is. All that matters is that it's true to yourself. And notice, Rorschach says, this rudderless world is not shaped by vague metaphysical forces. It's not God who kills children, not fate that butchers them, or destiny that feeds them to the dogs. It's us. It's only us. The only thing that exists in the world is human choice and human freedom and human action. And so that's the emphasis of existentialist philosophy. It's meant to reorient us, to make us realize that the only thing that gives things meaning within the world are the actions that we take, the values that we choose to believe in. And obviously, this is a horrifying thing to believe, it can be a bleak thing to confront, right? To confront this metaphorical wall and to have to overcome it. But I think there is a liberating element to it if you can overcome it courageously. And he says, was reborn then, free to scrawl own design on this morally blank world, was Rorschach. So, okay. We understand that Rorschach is existentialist in this sense. He has confronted the metaphorical death of God and gone on. So, pretty heavy here. So now we understand that Rorschach's mask is not merely a symbol of the psychological or unconscious ways that Kovacs has been shaped, but it's an existentialist symbol of the lack of inherent moral meaning in the world, of the inherent randomness that exists. Yes, some of us would like to look at the metaphorical ink blots, the random patterns in our existence, and say, look, this is proof that there is some sort of inherent meaning for me, that God must be watching over me. But Rorschach is saying, no, if you look at it, there's nothing there. It's just a random pattern, and we just create images out of it after staring at it and choosing to create some sort of image out of it. So what's left without any inherent meaning or God or cosmic structure? It's just human action. And that helps to explain Rorschach's philosophy, which is based on holding people accountable for their actions through violence and choosing to impose his own design on morality onto the world. Now, obviously, the violence aspect of Rorschach's philosophy is not something that existentialist thinkers like Albert Camus or Jean-Paul Sartre were advocating, and something that we will have to get to the heart of. I think there's a logical contradiction with Rorschach. He admits there's no inherent meaning that one could point to in order to determine moral values, but still chooses to impose universal and absolute values of right and wrong on others. And notice, what does he have to resort to in order to be able to do this? Since there is no inherent meaning in the world, the only way that he can convince others that his values in an inherently meaningless universe are correct is through violence. And so that should be something that probably scares us. And perhaps there is a contradiction here in Rorschach's philosophy. It also probably helps us to understand why he's associated with the far right. Because, he's called a fascist or a Nazi at multiple points throughout the graphic novel. And what is the unifying thread throughout any fascist movement? It's the willingness to use paramilitary forces to impose their beliefs on the world. And that is absolutely what Rorschach is doing. And so we should be asking ourselves, how can Rorschach justify this? Is there any good justification? Or is Rorschach's retreat back into a world of moral clarity after confronting the metaphorical void perhaps a logical contradiction, or at worst, something deeply pessimistic? That's a debate that we'll have to have and a conversation that we'll have to have, and one I look forward to having. But let's just see how the rest of this chapter plays out very, very briefly. We can see here, as Malcolm is leaving the therapist, he starts to see more negative things. Someone calls him the N-word. He sees Russians claim that fighting spilling into Pakistan was accidental. Nixon says U.S. will meet continued Soviet aggression with maximum force. Inside, article on nuclear alert procedure. It says that any dead family member should be wrapped in plastic garbage sacks and placed outside for collection. On 7th Avenue, the Hiroshima lovers were still trying inadequately to console one another. So, okay, look at this. In these three panels, he has confronted horrifying racism. He has confronted the possibility for extinction, and he has seen an image that is symbolic of the first dropping of atomic bombs. He comes home. His wife is angry at him. You can feel the tension there. The friends start asking him, just like, oh, man, what's going on with this case? Oh, boy, was she tied up and gagged and helpless? Just people trying to understand it. And then you can see, and by the way, take a message from your boy, Mr. L. Don't bring these things up at a dinner party. He says, no, she was 6. Her abductor killed her, butchered her, and fed her to his German shepherds. Everyone gets quiet. So you can see here, guys, that the therapist has had a profound transformation. He is now seeing or staring into the abyss being the loss of inherent meaning or the lack of inherent meaning or goodness within the world, the realization that the only thing that exists is depravity and violence and a lack of any sort of meaning there. And this all comes to a head on the final page, right? As she gets angry at him. And then he says, why do we argue? This is the right-hand side. Life's so fragile, a successful virus clinging to a speck of mud suspended in endless nothing. I mean, whew, what a detached way of articulating what human existence is. A human virus clinging to a speck of mud suspended in endless nothing. Pretty bleak. Next week, I could be putting her into a garbage sack, placing her outside for collection, referring to the threat of nuclear annihilation. I sat on the bed. I looked at the Rorschach blot. I tried to pretend it looked like a spreading tree, shadows pooled beneath it, but it didn't. It looked more like a dead cat I once found, the fat glistening, grubs writhing blindly, squirming over each other, frantically tunneling away from the light. But even that is avoiding the real horror. The horror is this. In the end, it is simply a picture of empty, meaningless blackness. We are alone. There is nothing else. Whew. Pretty dark, right? So you can see here that ultimately I think Rorschach wins the debate. He has persuaded the therapist that he is not just the product of psychological and unconscious forces, even if there is some good evidence to support that, but rather that there is philosophical validity to his statements. That in fact there is a real horror, and that horror is the lack of the emptiness, the meaninglessness within the universe, that there is no inherent meaning, and that we are thus cosmically isolated. Some core ideas of existentialism here. And then of course it ends on that, image of pure blackness, an image of nothingness. So hopefully now we appreciate what the Rorschach symbol really means. And then we see this final quote, right? Battle not with monsters, yes, lest ye become a monster. And if you gaze into the abyss gazes also into you. From the boy, Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche. So, right, the most obvious interpretation of this is the therapist, as he is confronting the monster of Rorschach, as he gazes into the abyss of Rorschach, the abyss also gazes into him and ends up shaping his worldview. But also perhaps we could think about it more broadly, right? About the ways in which Rorschach, as a character in confronting the abyss, seems to spread the abyss around. And perhaps as he tries to battle monsters, does he become a monster himself? Something that we were already exploring in Chapter 5. But hopefully we have a better understanding of what's going on in this chapter, especially with the Rorschach inkblot symbol. We got to explore some interesting ideas pertaining to Freudian psychology as well as existentialist philosophy. Hopefully you found that interesting. And we'll continue our march through this graphic novel next time with Chapter 7.